and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Christina of Sweden.
One day we will be remembered.
Usually, it's the royal we, because it's just me, but today I have a guest. Say hi to my friend Dora.
Hello.
Hi! I'm super excited. Christina of Sweden is different, but she's fun. Christina of Sweden was born the 18th of December, 1626. For my regular listeners, this makes her the most recent queen we've covered. She is in all of my other episodes future. Until now, the latest we've done is Queen Elizabeth I, and she died 23 years before Christina was born. Though her great aunt was a good friend of Queen Elizabeth, and she didn't die till Christina was about 4, so there is kind of a connection. She may have heard from her great aunt about her good friend, Queen Elizabeth I. Her father was King Gustavus Adolphus, and her mother was Queen Maria Eleonora. And Christina was their 4th child, but their first child to survive. That's just the time, you know?
Yeah.
The queen had firstly given birth to a stillborn daughter, and after the death of this baby, the queen's personality seemed to completely change. To today's mind, it sounds an awful lot like postpartum depression, exacerbated by the death of her daughter. And maybe the fact that her husband was almost always away at war. He was almost always gone. So she was alone. And then she had a daughter named Christina, who only lived for 1 year.
Oh.
And then a stillborn son. So this changed her personality even more. By this point, she was just kind of mean, and people noticed. She was going through a lot. And then she had a daughter named Christina, who only lived for 1 year.
Oh.
And then a stillborn son. So this changed her personality even more. By this point, she was just kind of mean, and people noticed. She was going through a lot. She would pick fights with her husband over very minor things in public. She would just kind of throw tantrums, but honestly, I see those more as panic attacks. But that wasn't really in the nomenclature back then.
Yeah.
And he wasn't running around cheating on her. She was just very unhappy. And by not running around cheating on her, I mean, he probably did cheat on her because that was the whole vibe at that time, but not publicly. He didn't have public mistresses. Everything was done in secret. So she wasn't like, oh my goodness, they saw you out with that lady. Then, in 1626, they had their 4th baby. And the midwives proudly proclaimed it to be a boy. And the queen was like, tell my husband immediately, we have a boy. Tell him right now. And they did. They ran off and told the king, you have a boy. And he was like, yeah, score. But then they realized their mistake, that it wasn't a boy. They had just assumed because she was a little hairy baby, but nobody actually checked.
Gotcha.
So who was going to break it to the king? No one wanted to. They're like, shoot, we just told him he had a boy, and now what? He has this lame girl. The king's sister ended up breaking the news to him a couple of days later.
Eesh.
Yeah, so for a couple of days he thought he had a boy, and she kind of just did it by bringing the baby to him, setting the baby down, and just unwrapping the baby, just being like, hey, look at this. It's a girl. So that's awkward. The king responded by saying he could tell she was going to be a smart girl because she had fooled them all. So he took it really well. King Gustav was very fond and attached to his daughter. He was like, this is it. Like, she's great. Her mother, on the other hand, wasn't. Either from the disappointment of her daughter's gender or postpartum depression, or probably both. She didn't bond with her daughter in any way. Not at all. She kind of just pretended she didn't have a daughter.
Ooh.
By the time Christina was 1 year old, her mother was described as being hysterical whenever her husband was away, which was most of the time, and all but ignored Christina. So she was fairly neglected baby. She had wet nurses and governesses and things, so she was cared for, but she didn't have... Her dad was always gone, and her mom was not fond of her. Queen Maria was allowed no say in her daughter's upbringing. King Gustav thought his wife's instability would pass on to his only daughters. He was like, keep my wife away from my daughter. So that just made it worse. And there were questions about Christina's safety around her mother. When Christina was a baby, her mother may have dropped her a few times, maybe on purpose, allegedly, injuring her in the process. And one time a large beam fell onto her crib from the ceiling, just like a large beam fell down. Although I don't know how that's her mom. Like, did she get up there with a screwdriver and just start loosening beams? That seems like poor construction. And when she was a child, she fell down the stairs. And fell is in heavy air quotes because most people assumed her mother had pushed her down the stairs. It wasn't the safest home life. Her collarbone was broken and it didn't heal properly, so she had a slight hunchback later in life after she grew. King Gustav had declared that Christina should get the same education a boy would have gotten as his heir. He was like, you know what, I don't even care that she's a girl. I'm going to raise her to be the best king ever. And she was raised as a boy. She learned how to sword fight and how to bear hunt, which super uncommon for girls at that time, bear hunting, but she was into it. She enjoyed this, different kind of childhood. In the summer of 1630, when Christina was 3 years old, King Gustav left for Germany to defend Protestantism, and he joined the 30 Years' War. That was a war in Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants during the time known as the Reformation. Gustav and Sweden joining the war really turned things around for the Protestants. They started doing pretty well against the Pope and all the Catholics. He was the savior. He was coming in and being like, I got this. I'm the war guy. I'm always at war. When King Gustav did not return home at the end of the summer, Queen Maria wrote that with her husband gone, she wanted to die.
Ooh.
Yeah, she begged his advisors to persuade him to come home. But he wouldn't. He was the war guy and he was saving the day. He's like, I can't just come home.
Yeah.
So it was decided that Maria would travel to see Gustav in the spring. Like, if you can't come to me, then I'm going to come to you, to your war. And Maria arrived the 10th of July, 1631, and was able to see her husband on the 11th of January, 1632. So if you didn't catch those dates, that was almost 6 months later. 6 months. She went to war, waited 6 months, and then she got to see her husband. But he was busy. He couldn't just hop over on his lunch break. He was fighting a war. The couple were seen together again on the 28th of October. Now keep in mind the last date I said was the 11th of January. So they were seen another time on the 20th of October. So this is almost another year later. And the very next day after seeing her, King Gustav broke camp and left. He was like, I'm out of here. Queen Maria wrote, without His Royal Majesty's presence, I am worth nothing, not even my life. So her mental health wasn't doing well. Queen Maria's mother was said to be the most beautiful queen in Europe, but she was also considered hysterical, unstable, and overly emotional. So maybe it was genetic. Word came that just 9 days after their parting, King Gustav died on the battlefield on the 6th of November, 1632. About a month before Christina turned 6. Queen Maria then returned to Sweden with the embalmed body of her husband. So Christina's mother had left to see her father and returned with his dead body. The king is dead. Long live the queen. And the new queen was 6-year-old Queen Christina. Little Queen Christina went to meet her mother on her arrival. She was the official queen, so she had to meet her mother and her father's body when they arrived, all official. The new Dowager Queen Maria declared that her husband not be buried in her lifetime, or at least it should be delayed as long as possible. And if it was absolutely necessary to bury him, she could always shorten her life and they could just bury them together, no problem. Which, not a great idea.
Yeah.
She also insisted that his coffin be kept open, and she went to visit it regularly. And she didn't seem to mind the putrefaction when it started to happen.
That's gross.
Yeah, she was real attached. They tried to convince the Dowager Queen not to visit her husband's decaying corpse so often, but to no avail. Instead, she just decided to move his coffin into her bedroom.
Ew.
Yeah, it's getting a little dark up in this castle.
Yeah.
As was the custom of the time, this is going to sound strange to us now, but this was totally normal at the time. His heart was put in a separate, little tiny coffin. This was totally normal for kings, especially warrior kings, because Bringing their hearts into battle was seen as good luck. So they put the heart in this little tiny coffin and sometimes bring it, on crusades with them or into war or to shrines. So at first, Queen Maria kept it with her all of the time, this tiny little heart coffin. She kept it in her bag. Then she got all DIY decorator and made kind of a shrine with candles that hung from her bedpost that included this little coffin heart. So that's a choice.
Yeah.
The Dowager Queen insisted that her daughter stay in her room with her, as she was the last living part of her husband she had left. But keep in mind, he's got his little heart coffin altar thing there. His open casket is there. This is where she's living and sleeping.
Gross.
For a year and a half, the king remained unburied. A
Ew.
year and a half. A year and a half. A year and a half. And there's
That
no
would smell
refrigeration.
really bad.
Yeah. I mean, he was embalmed, but that only helped so long.
So what do you mean by embalmed?
He had like, his heart had been taken out. Some of his organs had been taken out. And they didn't have the same embalming fluid we have now. But, like, he had been drained of blood and he had been filled with various herbs and spices. I don't really know how to describe it. It's not the same as now with chemicals, but he had been somewhat preserved.
Okay.
But not in a way that you can just hang out as a corpse in a bedroom for a year and a half. It was a
Right.
slower decaying process, but it was still happening. While King Gustav had been alive, Queen Maria had barely noticed that she even had a daughter. After his death, she became almost obsessive about her daughter. Christina was the 100% focus of her mother, now for the first time in her life. And not in a good way, because her mom would say things like, if I have to have a daughter, why does she have to be so ugly? Like, why couldn't I have a pretty daughter? A pretty daughter would be so much more helpful. You could marry her off, get alliances. Ugh, this is lame for a girl.
Yeah.
And the Dowager Queen asked the Chancellor what role she was going to play in her daughter's minority reign, because her daughter's still a little girl. So she's like, well, I'm her mom. Am I on the council or something? And the Chancellor, who we're just going to call the Chancellor in an ominous way, because this episode isn't about him, and his name is Axel Oxenstierna, so it's not the easiest to say. The Chancellor. And he was just really into his job. I don't think he really was the enemy, but to Christina, that's kind of how it seemed.
Okay.
So that is the perspective we're coming from. But no shade on Axel Oxenstierna's life. He wasn't a loving character, but he was the Chancellor, so he was trying to do his Chancellor things. And he told Queen Maria, we don't need you to do anything. In Sweden, we don't really do that. The moms aren't really involved. You go rest your pretty little mind. But also that wasn't true. Swedish moms were all the time involved in their minority children's councils. The king had just made it plain before he died that the Queen Mother was to have no part in running the country. Her mental health was not stable enough. He was like, she cannot do this. This is just going to push her too far.
Okay.
Gustav had decided that if he died, he wanted Christina to go to his half-sister, Catherine, and his brother Karl should be the regent. Dowager Queen Maria absolutely refused, especially that first part. She banned her sister-in-law from even visiting the castle where she lived with her daughter.
Okay.
The king's corpse was eventually forcibly removed and interred, but guards had to be posted at the site when the Dowager Queen tried to dig it up again.
Ew.
Yeah, she was like, no, I don't like this. I want him back. Maria Eleonora was considered very difficult by this point, and in 1636 she lost all parental rights to her daughter. The official reason was that Queen Christina was being neglected. She definitely was. And that her mother was a bad influence. Maybe there was a lot of insults going on. I mean, it was a bad situation. It's probably good that she did not stay with her mother.
I had a question.
Yes.
Do you know when cremation became an option?
Some ancient religions did do it, but they had, like in Europe, it wasn't a thing. Some ancient religions had a whole thing where they could build up the fire hot enough and stuff, but not in Europe.
Oh.
It would have been
Okay.
convenient if they had that, because then she could have his ashes, it's not that different from someone who keeps ashes, but all she had was her little heart coffin.
Wouldn't the heart coffin, wouldn't the heart, deteriorate
Yeah.
with,
Not great.
worms and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully she was keeping it sealed, the coffin, but
Hope.
yeah, it wasn't the greatest keepsake.
Okay.
So the queen lost all parental rights to her daughter. The chancellor decided to banish Queen Christina's mother to another castle. Like, you need to go, do your own thing somewhere else. And the Regency Council would decide if and when she could see her daughter. She was not free to just visit whenever she wanted. And spoiler alert, they didn't let her do it often. Christina went to live with her Aunt Catherine and her family, just like her father had wanted. And this seems to have been a happy time in her life. Maybe the happiest time. There was a family, other kids. It was a home for 2 years because at that point her aunt and foster mother died at the age of 54. So it's it's a fairly unstable childhood. By this point, Queen Christina was 11 and she needed a new foster mother. A lot has happened in her first 11 years. But the chancellor didn't want to create a situation in which Queen Christina would play favorites to a mother figure. If there was a specific noble family who raised her, well, then she'd have favorites, and that noble family would get perks, and the other nobles wouldn't like it. So he decided that the best option for this 11-year-old little girl was to have two separate foster mothers, and they would take turns taking care of the young queen. And also two different head ladies in waiting who would also be more like governesses. She's 11, so she doesn't need someone to change her diapers. But a head lady in waiting at this point would be more like a governess. And they would also take turns. So that kind of sucks for Christina. But it also worked. The young Christina didn't seem to bond with any of these women. They weren't even mentioned when she wrote her memoir. She didn't even mention that they existed. In addition, she also didn't seem to make many female friends. She liked hanging out with the guys. I mean, she really felt more male. She was raised as a boy, and she just was more into that. And the three exceptions of female friends were Ebba, Jane, and Louise. Those three we know about because they did get mentioned in her memoirs, but only because Christina was comparing herself to them and bragging that she was far more masculine than they were. She was like, these weak girls. Like, I hang out with them, and they're fine, but they are weak. Christina, like I said, from an early age, was educated as a royal boy would have been. And it suited her. Maybe too much. She was beginning to show signs of being kind of misogynistic. And not in the way that Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was famous for saying things like, I have the feeble body of but a woman, but I have the heart and mind of a man. So she would be like, I may look wimpy and female, but I'm hardcore. Christina would say things like, ugh, why did I have to be born female? Like, if only I could just wake up and not be female, that would be the goal. She didn't like anything feminine. She was educated in religion, philosophy, Swedish, German, Dutch, Danish, French, Italian, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, politics, and history. So she had a really, really good education. The Chancellor wrote of Christina proudly, she's not at all like a female, and that she had a bright intelligence, which was seen as more of a male trait, being smart. So that's unfortunate. But that was just the time. Her first cousin Charles was reportedly infatuated with her, the son of her Aunt Catherine, who she had grown up with for a couple of years. He was about 4 years older than her. And in 1642, they were reportedly secretly engaged before he left to serve in the Swedish army. She would have been about 16 and he would have been about 20. So I don't love that dynamic. Also, they were cousins. They grew up together for a couple years. But also, it might have all just been a trick. Because it seems like Christina was thinking maybe childbirth wasn't her thing. After all, it hadn't gone so well for her mother. And her cousin Charles was her current heir presumptive. If she never had children, he would be her heir. She later said she had an insurmountable distaste for marriage and for all things that females talked about and did. So she wasn't a girly girl. She was like, ugh, boring girl stuff. And it has been suggested that this betrothal was just an attempt to make Charles look more appealing to the people. She's like, I could totally marry this guy. And she's like, but I'm not gonna. But he could be your king, because I was gonna marry him. So, same thing, basically. So it might not have even been a real betrothal. She once stated it took more courage to get married than to go to war. She'd rather go to war than get married. And what you have to understand about Christina is that if you told her not to do something, that became the only thing she wanted to do. She was like, don't tell me what to do, which I find very relatable.
Yeah.
I hate being told what to do. She liked to stir the pot and make people, especially the Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, as uncomfortable as possible. She liked to poke the bear a little bit. When Christina was 18 years old, she was legally declared an adult. Her coronation was postponed, though, because Sweden was at war with Denmark and Norway, so no time for parties. The following year, Christina was working fairly hard for peace, against the Chancellor's wishes. He sent his son to argue against peace. Like, no, we can't just have peace with these crazy Catholics. In the end, she did negotiate a peace with Denmark and Norway. And it was a good deal for Sweden, and they were no longer cut off from the North Sea, which they had been when Denmark and Norway were like, you can't go by us. But maybe she just wanted that coronation party. She's like, okay, well, I can't have a coronation until we have peace, so I'm going to work real hard at peace because I want that party. This is when the Chancellor started noticing how different Christina's political views were from his own. Maybe because she liked getting under his skin. Maybe they were just different. Because this was her father's Chancellor, so it's possible she was just like, look, maybe we're going to do things a little newer here. Just 3 years later, the 30 Years' War ended, the same war that her father had died fighting in. During this war, the Swedish troops had looted many books and sent them back to Sweden to their young queen, and she was all in. She loved books and art. And if they were the spoils of war, so be it. So loot away. She was like, loot as much as you can. Just send it back to me. That's all I want. In 1649, 760 paintings, 170 marble and 100 bronze statues, 33,000 coins and medallions, 600 pieces of crystal, 300 scientific instruments, manuscripts, and books were transported to Stockholm. So they did a lot of looting from the Catholics. By 1650, her desire to collect men of learning around her, as well as books and rare manuscripts, became almost a mania. She really, really liked to learn. She started an academy, and she needed men of learning to teach there. Now, I've heard two stories, and I don't know which one is true. One is that she invited these men to Sweden, and they would wholeheartedly accept her invitation and travel to Sweden to teach at her academy. Or two, some of them may have been kidnapped and forcibly held in some kind of forced academic situation. She may have just been kidnapping smart guys and been like, teach me. Christina enjoyed studying Neo-Stoicism, the Church Fathers, and Islam. She was way into learning about different religions, and this would have been seen as unusual and unnatural, especially for a girl, but also because she was super into religions that weren't hers. Her father had died fighting a war to prove that Protestantism was the only way. And she was like, but what about this Islam thing? I might be into that. Hi guys, you've reached the end of part 1. And this is Patreon content, so the rest of it is on Patreon. And check it out at patreon.com/longlivethequeenpodcast.
You'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.